Section number 54 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Naomi Brewster, Melbourne, Australia. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3, by Henry Charles LEA. Book number 8, Chapter 3, Part 6, Spheres of Action, Protestantism. In the 17th century, scattering cases continued to occur from time to time among Spaniards, but their treatment indicates that there was no longer felt the necessity of making examples. Fray Juan González de Carvajal, a Benedictine who had been expelled from his order for repeated escapes, embraced Calvinism, which he confessed in France and obtained absolution. Again he confessed it judicially in the Roman Inquisition, and yet again in the Toledo tribunal, and was reconciled. Then, in 1622, he was tried in Valladolid, where he told all this freely, but with such signs of repentance that the consulta de fe voted only to reconcile him in a public auto, with 10 years of galley service and perpetual prison. While waiting an auto, he sought an audience and confessed that he had again relapsed. There was no choice now but to sentence him to degradation and relaxation, but the Suprema mercifully modified this to reading his sentence in the audience chamber, where his San Benito was to be removed, perpetual deprivation of his functions as deacon, and lifelong imprisonment. There was less disposition to mercy in 1630 in the case of Maria González, widow of Pedro Merino of Caneca, one of the exceedingly rare instances of a Spanish female Protestant. To the Valladolid tribunal she freely confessed her belief and persisted in it, despite earnest and prolonged efforts to undeceive her. There was no escape from condemning her to relaxation, and the Suprema confirmed the sentence, but whether it would have been executed cannot be told, for persistent labors were crowned with success. She was finally converted, and the sentence was changed to reconciliation. There may have been subsequent cases of Spaniards relaxed for Protestantism, but I have not met with them. In 1678, Thomas Castellanos was kindly sent to an insane hospital by the Tribunal of Toledo. In 1718, Pedro Ortiz of Valencia was reconciled with perpetual prison in the Cordova auto of April 24th, and, in that of November 30, 1722 at Seville, Joseph Sanchez of Cadiz appeared as a Calvinist and Lutheran, and was reconciled with irremissible prison. The Augustinian Fray Manuel Santos de San Juan, better known as Betacosa, would, in the 16th century, have been burnt as an undoubted Lutheran, although when arrested in 1756, it was merely as a regulista or upholder of the supremacy of the state. His Ensayo de Teatro de Roma, circulated in manuscript, was an essay to prove this, in a manner highly offensive to the hierarchy, and for this he was relegated for 10 years to the strict convent of Moriscos. During his confinement he wrote tracts to prove that Rome was Babylon, that the existing church in no way resembled that of the apostles, that there should be no order higher than the priesthood, that capital punishment for heresy as in itself a heresy, and other doctrines which no calificador could help qualifying as the rankest Lutheranism. But Betacosa was not relaxed, although he found associates to copy these heretical documents and circulate them. When his 10 years' confinement ended in 1767, he was again strictly secluded in a cell, from which in 1768 he managed to escape, eluding pursuit until in January 1770 he was recaptured and delivered to the Toledo tribunal. Here he underwent a second trial, resulting in a sentence of confinement for life in the convent of Sarria, Galicia, where he was to be kept incommunicado. This case illustrates why, during the decadence of the Inquisition, we hear little or nothing of Protestantism among Spaniards, although the spirit of persecution was unabated. Revolt against ultramontanism was no longer styled Lutheranism but regalism or Jansenism. With those whose dissidence went beyond discipline to dogma, it took the shape of the fashionable philosophy of the period and became naturalism or philosophism, deism or atheism, as the case might be. The Inquisition still did its work with more or less rigour, but the arena had shifted. While thus there had been little tendency to Protestantism among natives, since the inconsiderable outbreaks of 1558, foreigners furnished an ample field of labour. Spain had a reputation for wealth which rendered it attractive to the stranger. Its people held in contempt the arts and crafts in which Frenchmen and Flemings and Italians were adepts, and its internal peace seemed to offer a refuge to those whose industries were precarious in the incessant clash of arms through which the old order of things gave way to the new. Consequently, every city in Spain had a considerable population of foreigners, intent on earning a livelihood without much thought of spiritual matters. Some trials in the Toledo tribunal, about 1570, allude to French and Flemish printers then under arrest in Toledo, Barcelona, Alcalá, Salamanca, Valladolid and Granada. In 1600, the Count of Benavente, Viceroy of Valencia, estimated the number of Frenchmen there at 14 or 15,000, and added that there were vast numbers in Aragon. While many of these were undoubtedly Calvinists, seditiously concealing their faith, the majority were Catholics, more or less sincere, but even their orthodoxy was not of a quality to suit the Spanish standard. They had been accustomed to live in contact with heretics. They had no such fanatical horror of heresy as was universal in Spain, and they were apt to be careless in the observances which the Spaniard regarded as indispensable. All foreigners were thus subjects of suspicion, and the Catholic was as liable to arrest as the Calvinist. Jacques Zaccari, a dealer in rosaries and images in Burgos, in 1637, chanced to be relating his adventures with the heretics in France, who, in examining his baggage, had said, "Let him take these wares to Spain and bring us back good money," when one of his hearers expressed surprise that the Most Christian King would let heretics dwell in his land. This led Jacques patriotically to defend them as good baptized Christians who lived righteously according to their law. He was asked how they could be Christians when they did not go to mass and confess to priests, when in the heat of discussion he replied that there was not scriptural command of sacramental confession. For this he was denounced to the Valladolid tribunal. He was arrested and tried and all his property was sequestrated. It is no wonder therefore that the tribunals were kept busy with these cases and that the records are full of them, especially under the Crown of Aragon, owing to the propinquity of southwestern France, where Huguenotism was in the ascendant. In Saragossa, the relaxations for Lutheranism from 1546 to 1574, though amounting to only 7, were all of Frenchmen. Barcelona was more active. In an auto of May 16, 1561, there appeared for Lutheranism 7 Frenchmen, 1 Piedmontese and 1 Maltese. In that of July 11, 1563, there were 34 Frenchmen, 2 Italians and 2 Catalans, of whom 8 Frenchmen were relaxed in person and 3 in effigy. In that of March 5, 1564, there were 28 Frenchmen, 2 Catalans and 1 Swiss, of whom 8 Frenchmen were relaxed in person and 2 in effigy. From a report by Dr. Zurita of his visitation in the summer of 1564, we obtain a glimpse of how these autos were fed. At Perpignan, for Lutheranism, 5 persons were arrested with sequestration, of whom 4 and possibly all 5 were French. At Castellon de Empúries, Maestre Marquian, a Frenchman, was sent to Barcelona for trial. Jean de Aclin, a Frenchman of Aldas, escaped arrest by flight, and the arrest was ordered of Pierre Bayrach, a Frenchman of Flassa. When, simultaneously with this, the ambassador Saint Sulpice complained to Philip II of the cruelty exercised on his fellow countrymen, who were peaceably plying their industries, without creating scandal, the king coolly replied that the Inquisition acted without regard to persons, but nevertheless he would speak with the Inquisitor General. The complaint of cruelty was justified. In the rebuke which the Suprema administered to the Tribunal of Barcelona in 1568, as a result of de Soto Salsa's visitation, allusion was made to a case, in 1565, of a Frenchman named Anton Aymeric, arrested without evidence. His first audience was held at his own request February 23rd, the second on July 27th, when without more ado he was tortured and sentenced to reconciliation and confiscation. In another case of a Frenchman, Armand Jacobat, he was tortured without confession, but subsequently admitted some Lutheran errors, begging for mercy and desired to be converted, in spite of which he was relaxed and burnt, for which the Suprema held the tribunal to be gravely in fault. What became of those not burnt is seen in a report of December 1566 to Charles LEA, by his ambassador M. de Fortescue, that 70 poor Frenchmen, prisoners of the Barcelona tribunal, had been condemned to the galleys and had been delivered, in November, to Don Alvar de Bazan, who had taken the fleet to winter near Cadiz. In February 1567 he writes that, on complaint to the Duke of Alva, the latter had assured him on his honour that they were all dogmatizing Huguenots, that Frenchmen were never arrested for Protestantism if they had not said or done something scandalous. This was as mendacious as the repeating promises to release the galley slaves, which were always evaded until Fortescue recommended the seizure as a hostage, at Narbonne, of Andrea Doria, the naval commander-in-chief. At last, on December 20th, he reported the sending of royal letters to Doria to release them, but it is fairly questionable whether the order was obeyed. Again, in a list of complaints made by Charles IX to Philip, there was one concerning 5 of his subjects arrested in Havana and sent to Seville for trial, to which Philip replied that he was not accustomed and did not desire to interfere in such affairs, but nevertheless he would have the Inquisitor General requested to order the tribunal to despatch these cases with all speed. A more pleasing international episode is connected with the case of Robert Fitzwilliam, an Englishman, condemned by the Seville tribunal to 10 years of galleys and perpetual prison. He was received on board February 25, 1578, and in November 1582 his wife Ellen presented herself in the court of Madrid with a letter from Queen Elizabeth to Philip II, representing that the poor woman had beseeched her interposition, and that the liberation of the husband would be a favour which she would be glad to reciprocate. Under any other jurisdiction, the granting of such a royal request would have been a matter of course, but the assent of the Holy Office had to be secured. The existing papers fail to inform us of the result, but that it was favourable can scarce be doubted, for the devotion of the faithful wife made a strong impression even on the hardened officials, whose correspondence alludes to her in terms of respect and admiration. More summary was the process when, in 1572, the Barcelona tribunal sent a commissioner into French territory on some duty, and he was seized and held as a hostage for a Frenchman arrested by the tribunal, leading to an exchange of prisoners. The Val d'Andorra furnished another source of international questions, for the Barcelona tribunal claimed jurisdiction over it, while Jeanne d'Albret, as Queen of Navarre, held that it was her fief. In 1572 she put a French Vega there to administer justice, whereupon the inquisitors commenced to gather information about him as a presumable Huguenot, and the Suprema ordered them to arrest him if sufficient evidence could be found, but as the attempt was likely to prove dangerous, it need not be made unless the viceroy would furnish a sufficient guard, which apparently he declined to do. All foreigners, thus, were objects of suspicion, and the jurisdiction of the Inquisition was stretched to the utmost to prevent their infecting the faithful. In 1572 the Suprema ordered the tribunals of Aragon, Catalonia and Valencia to see that no Frenchmen were employed as teachers of reading and writing anywhere within their districts, experience having shown the dangers thence arising. Intercourse with foreigners was dangerous and was discouraged. In 1568 Inquisitor Morel, in reporting a visit to San Sebastian, expressed a desire to punish those who received and entertained and had particular friendship and dealings with French and English strangers, sometimes even giving them information enabling them to escape arrest, on all of which the Suprema commented by characterizing these as grave cases, which should have been sent to Logroño for trial. The Spaniard, too, who went abroad was an object of suspicion, and was held to strict accountability for his acts during his absence. In the Barcelona auto of June 21, 1627, there appeared a merchant of Marisa who, while in France, had listened to Huguenot preaching and had eaten flesh on Friday, for which he was penanced in 1,000 ducats and was recluded in a convent for 3 years. That under these influences, coupled with the growing poverty of Spain and the curse of its debased currency, the number of resident foreigners diminished greatly after the opening of the 17th century, may be assumed from the reduction in the cases of Protestantism in the records. Those of Toledo, from 1575 to 1610, show a total of 47, of which the last one occurred in 1601, while those from 1648 to 1794 contain only 11. In Valladolid, the reports of 29 years, between 1622 and 1662, show only 18 cases. In the Madrid tribunal from 1703 to 1751, there is only a single case of a Huguenot. In the 64 autos celebrated by all the tribunals between 1721 and 1727, there are only 3 cases. In Valencia, between 1705 and 1726, there was but a single case, a Calvinist who spontaneously denounced himself. Scattering and imperfect as are these statistics, they suffice to indicate how rapidly the number of foreign delinquents fell off after the year 1600, and that this was not the result of progress in enlightenment and toleration we shall see hereafter. It was simply that the Inquisition had succeeded in its efforts to limit intercourse between Spain and its neighbors, and to isolate it from European civilization. If this was the case in regard to nations presumably Catholic, we can readily conceive how much greater vigilance was exercised towards those which had lapsed into heresy. Commercial intercourse with them was unavoidable, but it was a necessary evil, to be restricted within the narrowest limits by deterrent regulations. For a while, indeed, the heretic trader took his life and fortune in his hands, when he ventured to make a Spanish harbour, as we have seen in the case of the good ship Angel. Even castaways were legitimate prey of the Inquisition, as was experienced by 17 English sailors of a fishing boat, who were captured by a French vessel and were thrown on shore in Fuerteventura, one of the Canaries. They were tried and escaped burning by conversion, after which 4 of them, Richard Newman, Edward Stevens, John Ware, and Edward Stride, managed to escape. As this showed them to be impenitent, they were prosecuted in absentia for relapse, and their effigies were solemnly burnt in an auto of July 22, 1587. The number of merchant vessels touching at the Canaries in fact furnished to the tribunal at one time the major portion of its work. A record of prisoners entered in its secret prison during 6 months of 1593, showing 13 belonging to the German ship San Pedro, 17 to the Flemish ship La Rosa, and 15 to the Flemish ship El Leon Colorado, besides a dozen English sailors whose vessel is not specified. These comprise all hands, officers and crews, merchants and passengers, and presumably, if the cargoes were not confiscated, they were effectively looted in the absence of their guardians. That such was the motive, rather than the protection of Spain from the infection of heresy, is inferable from a sentence of the Granada tribunal in 1574, condemning to reconciliation and lifelong galley service Jean Marino, a Frenchman resident in Malaga, because he had warned some Protestant sailors not to enter the port of Almeria. When there was prospect of a fat confiscation, indeed, the Inquisition paid little respect to the justice of the case, or to the parties who might suffer. There was a long dispute between Rome and Madrid over 2 cargoes of alum which the papal camera was sending to England, when the ships were seized and the cargoes sequestrated by the Tribunal of Seville, on the ground that the English crews were heretics. This barbarous policy necessarily made itself felt in the cost of foreign commodities, especially after the troubles in the Netherlands had cut off or reduced that portion of the carrying trade. Under this pressure, in 1597, an exception was made in favour of the Hansa. Instructions were issued by the Suprema that, when its ship arrived with merchandise, the persons in them were not to be interrogated about their religion, nor on that account were the ships or cargoes to be sequestrated or confiscated, unless while in port they had offended against the Catholic faith, and in such a case only the property of the delinquents was to be seized. Search, however, for prohibited books was to be made, as was customary with Catholic vessels. There was also an approach to admitting the Dutch in a royal order of February 27, 1603, providing that Holland vessels and crews bearing passports from the Archdukes of the Netherlands were to be allowed entrance to Spanish ports, and their persons and property were to be secure. But this was revoked, December 11, 1604, subject to the 12 months' notice provided in the order. A treaty of peace with England covering this matter was ratified by James I, August 1, 1604, and by Philip III, June 16, 1605. During this interval, in November, 1604, an English ship with a crew of 20 men, coming for a load of corn, touched at Messina and then at Palermo. In the latter port it was visited by the officials of the Inquisition, when the men admitted that they were Protestants and wished to live in that faith. They were all arrested and appealed to the Viceroy, the Duke of Feria. He was powerless save to write a private letter in which he declared that the arrest was a disservice to the king and tended to destroy the treaty agreed upon, wherefore the Inquisition ought to dissemble and treat the heretics well, for the public good. The inquisitors thereupon assembled 10 consultors, reaching the conclusion that the Englishmen could be liberated only on condition of giving ample security that they would go to Spain and present themselves before the inquisitor general. For strangers this was a virtual impossibility, and it doubtless proved to be so, for in 1605 we hear a certain Englishman, who had been admitted to penance with the San Benito and required to live for 2 years in certain monasteries for instruction in the faith. They had contrived to escape, but were tracked and found on board a French ship without their San Benitos. As the tribunal did not care to support them, they were ordered to be distributed separately to monasteries in the mountains far from the sea, where they were for 10 years to perform labour without pay. When such irrational cruelty was habitual, international comity and the commercial interests alike demanded that a curb should be placed on the irresponsibility of the Inquisition. Accordingly, in the English Treaty of 1604, Article 21 provided that the vassals of King James, coming to or residing in the Netherlands or Spain, should not be molested or disturbed on account of matters of conscience, so long as they gave no occasion for scandal, and that corresponding instructions should be issued by the king. This Philip did, under the same date of June 15, 1605, ordering that English subjects should not be held accountable for acts prior to their coming to Spain. While in Spain they were not to be compelled to enter churches, but if entering voluntarily, due respect must be paid to the venerable sacrament, and if it was met on the street, they must kneel, or take another street, or enter a house. If anyone were prosecuted for contravention of these rules, only his own property was to be seized and not a vessel or cargo, or the goods of others in his charge, and to the observance of all this the king pledged his royal faith and word. The Suprema had previously, December 11, 1604, issued instructions similar to those of 1597 for the Hansa. On July 14, 1605, it transmitted to the tribunals the articles of the treaty, but it seems to have objected to the royal declaration, for it delayed until October 8, embodying its provisions in a carta acordata. This was too reasonable to be acceptable to Spanish fanaticism. Archbishop Roberta, in 1608, varied his efforts for Morisco expulsion with an earnest appeal to the king, expressing the grief which he had never ceased to feel since he heard of the peace with England, fearing as he did the offence given to God which would bring many evils on Spain. His affliction had increased in view of the excesses committed by the English in Valencia, living publicly in their religion and causing great scandal and evil example to the faithful, and at much length and with many instances he proved that peace with infidels was forbidden by Holy Writ. This memorial was duly considered in the Council of State, when the Comendador Mayor of Leon reported the king had ordered the Inquisitor General to be notified, so that he might instruct the tribunals to exercise great vigilance and to punish all who gave occasion for scandal. When in 1609 the 12 years' truce was concluded with the United Provinces, the Dutch naturally claimed the same privileges as the English, and these were embodied in Article 7 of the treaty. The Inquisition did not submit quietly to this restriction on its powers, and in 1612 it issued a carta acordata, repeated in 1616, asserting that these privileges applied only to transient strangers, and that those who were resident and kept houses were subject to the tribunals in all matters of faith like any Spanish subjects. It invoked, moreover, an old regulation of 1581, ordering special watch to be kept on them, so that what they did in private as well as in public might be known, full reports being sent to the Suprema. In 1620 it revived another instruction of 1581 forbidding the foreigners in the seaports to keep inns or lodging houses. Whether any trouble arose from these arbitrary constructions of international compacts does not appear, but at least they manifested a desire to render the position of foreign heretics as precarious and uncomfortable as possible. Section 54